after such a horrible battle, we all had to take stock of what we had won, what we had lost. Though I can't say we won much except a whole bunch of non biological and biological debris that's floating around a bunch of systems right now. But we had maintained the line and we had held the line, which was vitally important. We went to each of the sectors, my ship, looking for any survivors of the demonoid race, helping out where we could, as many planets were hit with multiple layers of debris, which was like hitting an entire planet with artillery, along with a whole bunch of slaves that had been used basically as cannon fodder. We didn't find many, just over a dozen. You could say a baker's dozen of them. Most of them looked like hell. A couple of them missing parts, most of them emaciated, and all of them scared out of their minds. They had seen what humans can do, so being around their own kind really, really helped. I allowed my fabricator to be used to make sure that basic necessities were up and running, especially on friendly planets. The military's individual could fix whatever they wanted. They had all the equipment they needed. However, the Martian and Venusian fleets immediately returned to the Sol sector as soon as they had verified they had everyone, grabbing a little bit of resources, just enough to get back, but it wasn't anything they cared about. We were allies, but we were not their defenders anymore, and they would still have to cover their own ass. Most areas, homeworlds mainly, had a small contingent of human ships around, just in case. And of course, those contingents made sure that all the defense satellites were still up and running. In fact, they got an upgrade, about 4 times as lethal as the old ones. And it took a long time to replace them all, but I guarantee the species were not even giving the first flip of a crap that it took so long, or that the resources to make the new satellites were being siphoned away from any materials that might come down to the planet to be used. I think they were more concerned, like the rest of us, with making sure they didn't get shot from the darkness again. We didn't know if there was another fleet just waiting in the void for us. And it was a good thing that nothing showed up, because taking stock of the human population was absolutely horrifying. As it stands now, in our sector, we have 2 planetary colonies, 7 off-world colonies, which means any type of moon and or asteroid that maybe currently has a colony on it. And that's about it. Our numbers are down below 2 billion. For an area that large and keeping a fleet as large as we have intact and running, that is very, very few people. Very few. We worried that they would once again come at us with numbers and we just would not be able to face them off again. The fleet itself, combined human fleets, had taken almost 24% losses in personnel. There was over a 38% loss in material losses. It was just insane to see all these. The numbers added up very, very quickly. I very, very quickly returned all the personnel as soon as they were healed up through our medical bay to their ships to make sure they could go home and see their families. I was worried as the ships began to come back, the shuttles, the fighters, the recovery craft, whoever it was. I wanted to make sure we had everyone. And of course, we lost our own too. Though we had retrieved a few, that definitely had not refilled our ranks. I looked around as many of them worked, and I realized that for them to be able to live, they would have to actually have a populace. Thankfully, they have the ability to have children now, but without medical intervention, it didn't work. Something had to be done, but for that to truly happen, for them to expand, they would need a planet. So eventually, I asked the Chitters again to take that one fertile planet on the ass end of their territory. They didn't respond right away, and I found out why fairly soon. That planet was given asset denial treatment. For some reason, the invading forces, instead of trying to take a planet that had almost no population, they realized how important the food was to us. It must not be important to them. They fired their own ordnance into the calderas that were on that world and caused every single volcano that was active to blow. Whether it be a standard volcano or a supervolcano, they all exploded. Now, the type of explosions that came out were all pretty much the same. One giant burst. But because of that, the entire planet was covered with several feet of ash. We wouldn't even be able to send down any of our shuttles without some of the mechanisms starting to gum up. As we looked at the planet, I talked to the queens over the comm systems, and I asked them, do they still want this planet? Are they planning on colonizing it? They laughed with that strange squeakiness that they have and actually said, if you want it, you can have it. It is of no use to us anymore. And they all did their version of a nodding in agreement. I simply sent them a contract allowing them to sign it and saying that they would relieve this planet and leave it under my care, and those are the demonoids. They had no problems at all. This meant that much of what they were going to need their fleet for could be freed up. They didn't have to send 2 battle groups to watch over a planet which was now basically a dust ball. I looked at what was there, and many of the demonoids would look out the windows, the viewports, and see this seemingly dead world. But they didn't see something I did. What I saw is the same thing I saw in my crew, and the same thing that I saw in humanity as well, is that no matter how deep you burn us, we will rise from the ashes and build better. So we did. It was a long process finding what we needed, and what we needed was ice, as much as we could. Any type of frozen water we could get, we simply dropped on that planet and let the atmosphere cook it off. The more hydration that was on there, the better. The wetter it was, the faster the fires would go out and more the atmosphere would cool, along with adding to said atmosphere. This would take just under 7 months to get it to the point where you could breathe the atmosphere itself. However, we would still go down with masks on, as there was still a lot of ash in the air. Many of the demonoids found out that just wearing a mask and nothing else was a bad idea. The cloud cover, the dust cloud that is, tended to cool everything off. I told them it was going to be a nuclear winter, but they didn't want to listen. I remember as a few of them just started shaking as I'm standing there in a thick coat going, I told you. You going to listen this time? Shaking my head and going, kids. Regardless of that, we had prefabricated what we needed and were bringing it down to the surface piecemeal. We set up a small colony, several actually, each one roughly 75 to 180 personnel. That's where it came into. Everyone could decide which groups they wanted to be. Surprisingly, they kept things intermixed pretty good, although there was a strange look as though they wanted to stay with the same color scheme as each other, which I thought was just very strange, but hey, to each their own. Not that they strictly abided by that, mind you. Reason? I made sure they didn't. I knew that would cause problems down the road, so they still had to intermix a little bit. All in all, everything started all right. We set up the housing units. We set up areas where they could have greenhouses. And then they started to set up something strange, shelves. I said, no, plant it right into the dirt. They all looked at me strange. Why? This is volcanic ash. There's no way. This is powdered rock. How in the hell is anything going to grow here? I laughed. You would be amazed what will grow here. And I was right. Volcanic soil, it doesn't matter what planet you're on, is still the most fertile soil you will ever find. Even though the oceans, if you can call them that, were still covered with a layer of the ash. We could still get enough water. We just had to drill to get the groundwater. It was clean to water the crops, and the crops grew like crazy. And as they reached their first harvest, I started to realize that the demonoids had started to grow something else as well. Many of the females were starting to show. I had to do a little research to find out what their actual cycle would be. It's actually a little different. They would actually be pregnant for 14 months. Why? I have no idea. Apparently things grow slow there. I don't get it. But it was nice to be around when the first ones were actually delivered. To see the first ones come out, even though you could hear the females always screaming, "I'm never gonna do this again! No, I'm never gonna do this again!" All things change as soon as they put the child to her chest. Yes, that was very quick to adjust their way of doing things. We did everything we could to expand as fast as possible as well. I spent many, many days inside an exosuit simply loading crates, moving them around, sending things through the fabricators, taking the items out that had been done, setting them aside, stacking them the right way, getting them inside shuttles, bringing those shuttles down. Shuttles would come up with different materials. We had to put that in the fabricator, and around and around and around it went. It was beyond tedious, but I knew it was important. While this was all going on, I kept checking in with all the comms nets to make sure that we were not having any other issues. As far as the enemy was concerned, this was a dead world, and it was the only, well, it was an M-class planet. It's not one anymore. The other planets in this sector are either solid rock or a few gas giants. There's not much. There's only 6 planets. That's it. 1 star. Thankfully, no twin pulsars, so we'd have trouble. The kicker is, the sun was not giving off all that much radiation, which was good, because even now, seriously, people put on a shirt at least? I told them that I would burn if I was out in the sun, which I actually checked to see how much radiation was coming off, and there wasn't much at all. This is what gave me the key indicator of why the actual planet had not started to recover with its own flora or fauna. Not only was every animal killed off, but the fact that the radiation was so low, the plants weren't strong enough to survive all those calderas exploding. The heat that came off cooked everything down to bacteria. Everything that was grown here, everything on this planet was only what we brought. And what we brought down was strictly to make the planet recover and to also feed us. It would take years. Years that I stayed either on the planet or on the ship. I went to every single colony on that planet several times. And they were so grateful when finally they could see the oceans, which were very small actually. If you compare it to a map of, say, Earth, the oceans are only the size of maybe South America, and they dot the landscape, many of which are saltwater, but not all of them. There are many massive freshwater lakes as well. This would be where many of the colonies would set up, right next to the freshwater lakes. I knew eventually, one day, the saltwater areas would become beautiful beaches that eventually people would pay to come visit, but that would not be today. Hell, I wondered if we'd all be around to see it, considering how tenuous this piece was. Right now, all we could do was raise everything. I thought to myself, finally, I don't have to take life anymore. I can just grow it, and I can raise it. This is the only thing an old soldier ever wants to do. They don't want to keep going through the shooting and the killing and the losing of people. Eventually, the chitters got wind of what we were doing and started to ask if they could set up their own outpost there. I was extremely hesitant to allow this, as they had agreed to allow me to have this planet. If they had come and simply taken the planet from us, or decided to land colonists on it, there would have been a very, very big issue between the different species, mine and theirs. Not to mention the demonoids themselves, which were very good at combat at this point. In many cases, if you actually went demonoid versus chitter, it's a very one-sided contest, despite how small the demonoids are. Even an alpha chitter would have a problem with them. That all being said, it wasn't just them. If you look on the universal map, there are 3 different species that border this sector. The chitters being one, the Zels being the other, and just a tiny little bit is the Vidarans. You know what, I keep mispronouncing that for some reason. Maybe because I don't have a forked tongue like they do. Regardless of that, they all looked at how fertile this planet was, and since food is such a hot commodity, they realized how important this one planet would be. I realized what it was when I first seen it, but I'm glad that others didn't. If you're thinking, how come the humans didn't come and settle? Well, they wanted to. Several colonists wanted to get away from Venus and Mars, even though Earth would still be another decade or 2 before people could start settling on it again, wanted to find a place where they could settle. And they realized that we had terraformed this planet very quickly. Of course, videos of me walking around without a respirator really made people want to join. But this was not my planet. This belonged to my crew. This belonged to the demonoids, and they would have to decide. I called them together one day and put this whole issue in front of them, and they simply looked at me confused. Why don't you make the call? It's not my planet. I pointed to the sky. That's my ship up there. But this planet is yours. I even emphasized by using a knife hand. This is your planet. You must decide. This planet belongs to all of you. The look on their faces as they slowly began to realize that they actually have a home now. They are creating a home. Resonated through every single one. Some a little quicker on the trigger than others, of course. But it was still amazing to see this. As I put that out, I let it stew for a while before continuing. I'm going to go to my ship. I want you all to contact me once you have figured this out. Once you all decide. If you so desire, I can help you design a separate government away from me. Is that okay, or is that something you would decide on your own? And don't say anything yet. Call me when you're ready. And I still remember waiting in the ship for only a few hours. Hell, it took me more time to go up to the dang ship and come back down than it took for them to actually make their decision. They did request for me to design a government for them. It would be a representation government. However, each one would be under a certain set of laws. I remember reading a certain book, had something about troopers in a starship, had a certain type of governments that worked really well. And I used that as a baseline. And it worked out wonderfully. Within a year, I'm up in my ship, simply plugged into my ship, listening to all the comms traffic. I had gotten so good at it that I could listen to over 50 different frequencies at the same time and not get confused. That took a long time to learn. Basically like learning how to play the bagpipes while playing the piano with your feet at the same time hard. But it can be done. And I was watching everything happen. Each of the small colonies around the planet were doing exceptionally well, growing well. And as they began to expand beyond their small borders, and their borders actually started to reach each other, I worried that for some reason that the different colonies on the planet would start fighting each other, but instead they simply came together. Isn't it amazing what survival mindset will do? What's also amazing is the fact that we have lived so long. Our medical technology has helped us all survive. If you survive the war, if you survive the conflict, you ain't dying. We don't age. At this point, I don't even need an upgrade in the medical. It's just not required. My cells regenerate themselves, and so does every single human. You might wonder if we're still human. Believe me, we still are. But we had to just kind of relax and let these new species do what they were. Along with that, I reached out. I would send constant communication to Junior. He was a grandfather now. His little ones would always pester him as he was trying to talk with me, as they would climb all over him as he used to climb all over me. I found it hilarious. And a little bit of karma, if you want to think of that way. Along with that, I made sure that the queens in the chitter area knew exactly what was going on. They bugged me, no pun intended, constantly to allow them to actually land on the planet. My worry was that once they landed, they'd never leave. And if they decided, well, I'm just going to make a home here, then we'd be in trouble. Especially since now, as I looked on the planet, the hay that we had brought had seeded out wonderfully. The wheat that we brought was huge, massive fields waving slowly in the breeze. In every small area, there was a small farm. We didn't have any large animals, so we were stuck with things like sheep and goats, ducks, chickens, that sort of thing. I had been able to procure at very high cost several fish, but I had chosen specifically which ones because I had to look to see what type of biosphere was starting to form, and I didn't want to destroy it with the wrong type of fish. You let one go and it starts tearing things up, you better catch it. And if there's two, you're screwed because you're never catching them again. All in all, things ended out very, very well on planet Harvest. It would be several years after that before any major issues happened. Several of the scouts teams had gone out to the distant realms of our own sectors to find out what was going on with the number 2s and number 3s. Were they still gearing up for another fight? I know it would take a long time to replace all the personnel. What about those that we had taken, the first ones? What had happened? Well, the first ones had quite literally collapsed as a society. Those that did not return home immediately surrendered their ships and their slaves so that they could be there, turned into roving bands, each one trying to get leverage on the other, whether that be through political means or through straight up military means. It didn't matter. But any of those not on their home planet were more than willing to kill each other for no reason. And if they're willing to stay out there in the void and just kill each other, who am I to give a crap? The number 2s and 3s, we found out, had some major problems. They were counting on taking these sectors so that they could plunder them for resources. Reason being, the number 4 and 5 that were out there were still strong, and they were pushing more and more across, making it more and more difficult for the number 2s and 3s. And yes, I will keep calling them that because I honestly can't pronounce their damn names. But they are on the verge of collapse themselves, shrinking more and more and more into their home sectors, trying to have enough ships, satellites, and anything else to make sure that they don't get straight up overrun like they tried to overrun us. Now, the whole idea of taking out a whole planet, I haven't heard of any of that. Not since this planet I'm standing on was damaged, almost beyond repair. But what they hadn't realized is all they had done was make us stronger. Again, now we had more food than we knew what to do with, and now we were becoming an extremely strong area. Though limited to one sector, i.e., one planet, the demonoids now controlled a lot of wealth. Unfortunately, we all know that when you're wealthy, there's always those that will come to take it from you through one means or another. However, they still have their godfather overwatching them. This ship may not have the main guns of a dreadnought, but if this ship was to be destroyed, it would bring all sorts of Armageddon, as the demonoids had slowly spread out also to different areas and shown themselves to be not only reliable companions, but some of the best friends we have ever had. And with that, nobody wanted to take this planet. They were more than willing to trade for it. And when they traded certain items, everything turned out well. And when I mean certain items, certain animals in particular, though I didn't want it to turn into exactly what Earth was, I did want to get it somewhat close. Reason being is that many of the species need the certain rotation of the planet. They need the certain tides to survive. They need all that. This planet's not set up that way. The low amount of radiation, the 2 moons, it's a mess. That being said, eventually, I knew something would come to pass. And as I thought we were going to be bracing for another attack, we saw a whole bunch of ships come out of FTL, and I scanned over, and I realized it was a mixed fleet. But it wasn't an enemy mixed fleet. What in the ever-loving crap? It was an envoy. 4 ships of the 3 different species that were close by had showed up, all pretty much blinking in at the same time. Okay, what in the ever-loving shit, people? I immediately put out a welcome to them and then asked them their intentions on this world. They stated their intentions were pure. They simply wanted to set up a transfer post for each of their species. And my response was, "What?" My ship was actually busy setting out different defense satellites at the time, so I didn't know if I needed to activate them. I simply got a hold of the council down on the planet, let them know what was going on. I didn't even realize that they had contacted these species and decided to form agreements with them, pacts with them, alliances. It's not my planet, it's not my call, but I sure as hell wanted to be on the planet. So I simply left the AI in charge. She ended up sending out all the rest of the satellites before even the conference was finished. All in all, it wasn't a difficult conference to be at. All the representatives said the same thing. They simply wanted one area. They dictated a certain size that they would want, and they would not go beyond this. It was simply a lease. They would have to pay, of course, to stay on the planet, but the rent wasn't exactly high at all. And they had to stick with certain areas. They could not go beyond those areas, nor could they bring any type of foreign anything onto this planet. This was simply for trade purposes, so that the demonoids wouldn't have to spend so much time transporting goods off planet, as there wasn't many of them. Seriously, we're looking at barely 500,000 at this point. And the planet was just barely falling into its own harmony. I was looking mainly at the chitters on this, as they, being an insectoid race, had a tendency to accidentally bring all sorts of bacteria and junk onto worlds. That was not their fault. That was a simple problem with the fact that their carapace picks up a lot of stuff. So they would have to many times go through decontamination when they come on and off this world, along with any goods that they bring on. They gladly agreed to it. Along with that, the Phtharans were more than happy to trade. Their population was quite literally exploding. I'm looking over at one of these folks who was partially feline, and I was like, okay, what do you mean exploding? You want to give some numbers? He explained that they don't have children. They have litters. Okay, define litter here. Can you put a number on that? I asked him. Oh, sure. We have at two. Two to four. 2 to 4 children every time. And what's the biological capacity on this? The what? How fast do you reproduce? How long does it take a female to go through all her processes? Oh, by your timeline, 7 months. That's quick. He looked at us confused. That's normal. For you, that's normal. Never mind. Anyways, what about the rest of you? And with that, everything was pretty much settled. The Zells didn't have too much to say. They just wanted to set up their own trading post and have everything good to go. And things went as smooth as satin on silk. It was incredible. What actually worried me was how fast each of the species had set up their little trading post. I would have to watch them close just to be safe. Approximately 7 years later. We were on Planet Harvest. I was still back up in my ship, just watching the skies, making sure nothing bad was going to happen. Although I did have to take a break to do a little exercise. You can only be in that command couch for so long before your whole body just starts flinching. You want to get out and move. Alarms started to go off, so I ran up, the AI screaming in my ear, let me know. All right, Sally, what do you got? As soon as I plugged in, she laid it all out for us. As it turned out, several of the slave masters were begging for help, actually asking for us to go and help them fight their war against the other 2 slave masters. One of them, number 4, was actually on the way to number 3's homeworld, and they weren't sure they would be able to maintain anything. And if the homeworld falls, they might as well just put themselves in shackles because they themselves would be slaves. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Really, you guys enslave folks for what? 2,500 years, and now you want the slaves to come help you? What? How does that make sense? However, the councils of each species deliberated on it for a very long time. And when I say very long time, a couple of days. Normally something like this is voted on right away, but they went back and forth and back and forth. Eventually, they came down to one item. We would help you, but on conditions. What conditions would it be? The conditions are, you will free every single slave species you have. If they have a home planet or home sector, you will leave them there and you will withdraw all your forces away from there and never, ever try to enslave them again. You will also owe us a certain amount of tonnage of organic and non-organic materials. This is non-negotiable. Certain slaves will be brought back to the home sectors that we control. Do you or do you not agree with these terms? We did not hear back for almost 2 weeks. But when we received the message, it changed everything.